Welcome, everyone. We're very excited to bring you this webcast, How Does Your Employee Culture Compare to Other Organizations? Because it's based on a survey that HR.com conducted in partnership with CultureIQ. Such partnerships are a key component of our Excellence Essentials themed research offering, in which organizations sponsor and collaborate with HR.com to produce research focused on their areas of expertise or interest. As part of the offering, sponsor companies present the findings of the research in a webcast like this one, and their brands are associated with a published research report and an article in the Excellence Essentials publication of their choice. Before we begin the webcast, I would like to remind you that it is approved for HRCI and SHRM recertification credits. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. After the webcast, you will receive an email from HR.com within 1 to 2 business days. It will include the certification credit information. You can also log in to your HR.com account and go to your View My Credits page, where you can see the credits that you have received. If you have any questions today for our presenter or for HR.com, please type them into the Questions tab on your GoToWebinar control panel, and we will follow up with you. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to our presenter, Rea Abrahams.
Thanks, Kathy. Appreciate the intro. It's been a pleasure working with HR.com to put together our white paper, which you all will be receiving, and to put together this presentation for you. Right off the bat, I've been in loads of these webinars, so I know you're probably all wondering if you can get these slides later. You can. They'll be posted on HR.com. However, you will not be able to receive an actual recording to send to your team, so I hope you're able to take good notes during this webinar. Also, Kathy mentioned briefly that you can submit questions. Please do so throughout this presentation. My colleague Jamie will be reading through them, and depending on how much time we have at the end, we'll get to as many as we can. So thank you so much. I will start with an introduction so you can get to know me. Thanks, Jamie. So my name is Rea Abrahams, and I am a culture strategist with CultureIQ. Yes, that's my official title, Culture Strategist, and I love it. At CultureIQ, I partner with our clients to measure, understand, and strengthen corporate culture. So we really are in the business of corporate culture, which is why we're excited to be able to talk to all of you today about it. A little bit more about me. I have always loved the people side of business. I always felt like people were a company's best asset. Before joining CultureIQ, I worked as a consultant with Deloitte's human capital practice. And there I really focused on organizational transformation of all kinds. Primarily I worked on change management, communications, training, all things that I'm sure within your own HR departments you're thinking about regularly. But really quick story as to how I got to where I am today and why I joined CultureIQ. So when I was back with Deloitte, one of my clients was a Fortune 100 energy company. And they hired Deloitte to help them because the federal government basically imposed a slew of regulations and mandates that this company and all energy companies have to comply with by 2017 or this year. And so we came in with a plan to do communications and training because we wanted people to understand the importance of compliance and why they needed to be compliant. But that's really boring for everyone, especially those employees. No one wants to think about rules all day. And what we realized is you could do all the training in the world, you can do all the communications in the world, but what we were really trying to do was change the behavior, the day-to-day behavior of these employees at this company so that this idea of compliance was just part of their daily routines. And as you can imagine, based on the theme of this webinar, that really came back to corporate culture. How do we create a culture where this is possible? So I really loved that project and wanted to work on culture first time. I really found my calling and my passion. So I found CultureIQ, where I get to work with all sorts of companies, focusing primarily on corporate culture as a key driver for business. And it's my favorite subject. So thank you all so much for joining this webinar. I hope that you gain a tidbit that you can bring back to your teams afterwards. So with the agenda, it looks a little long, and we have about 45 minutes of content here before we'll take some questions, so bear with me. But we'll briefly go through the objectives, an overview of the survey we did with HR.com, like Kathy mentioned. I'll show you some of the scores from that survey, and then we'll dive into 3 main topics. The first is corporate culture and profitability, so linking corporate culture to the financial metrics at your organization. Next, we'll talk about measuring culture and the importance of measuring culture. And finally, we'll talk about managing culture. We asked a lot of questions about managing culture on our HR.com survey, have some good insight there. And then we'll just wrap it up with a summary, some recommended next steps, and then we'll open the floor for some questions. So this was published on the HR.com website when you signed up for this webinar, but I'm hoping today you will leave with an understanding of how you all and all of the participants of our survey manage and measure their employee culture, and maybe get a few ideas for what you can bring back to your organization. We'll talk about which company culture activities and efforts HR professionals find most effective and how they are measuring those, if they're measuring those. And then finally, throughout this whole presentation, we'll be talking about how corporate culture can really be your competitive advantage. We talk a lot with our clients about how corporate culture really is a key component to driving business. And what I think is really interesting, just before we go on to the next slide, is that this survey had all different industries, all different size corporations. So obviously certain things are going to feel more applicable to your organization than others. You might think, oh, we're a global HR department, so this won't work for us. So what I ask of you during this whole webinar is to think about and reflect on your organization, and one thing after this webinar that you can do today or tomorrow or at least this week to take a step towards strengthening your corporate culture, or at least starting the conversation with your leadership team. So that's my ask of you today. Thank you. Okay, so moving on. Let's start diving in. Oh, well, first, really quickly, Kathy mentioned we did this survey with HR.com. We had a little under 600 participants, like I mentioned, wide range of industries and sizes. But the goal was really to understand HR's perspective into the importance of company culture and to learn more about what HR is doing to manage and measure those initiatives, if anything. So again, I know you all are HR folks on this webinar, and this really was a survey for you. So while we're here, or why we're here, excuse me, I like this quote a lot. Customers will never love a company until the employees love it first. This quote came from, sorry, go back really quick. This quote came from Simon Sinek, who I'm sure some of you have seen his video that's recently gone viral, at least on my Facebook page, called Millennials in the Workplace. And it's him talking to some talk show hosts, but he talks about how millennials are viewed as entitled and lazy and all of these things we keep hearing. But his whole point is it's not their fault, and he gives reasons such as parenting and technology and things I'm sure you guys have heard about. But millennials are becoming the largest component of our workforce. And so I think this quote really speaks to the employees, no matter what demographic they are, have to love their company in order for customers to love their company. And if you have a chance, you can Google Simon Sinek and watch his video on YouTube. It's great. So with that, we will launch our first poll question, which is, how well does your company actively manage its corporate culture? And I know that might seem a little vague, the word manage, so it's up for interpretation. If you think your company is doing anything to actively manage its corporate culture, rated on a scale of 1 to 5. 5 is extremely well, you are totally in control of your corporate culture. 1 is, I have no idea what you're talking about, we definitely don't manage it. This wasn't a question in our white paper. We'll get to other questions that were in the white paper, but it's interesting for me to understand and for you all to understand where the HR folks on this call fall and where their companies fall into actively managing their culture. As you take this poll, think about, is your leadership being intentional? Is your HR department being intentional about creating a positive corporate culture? Do you talk about it? Are there initiatives just for culture? Do your leaders talk about it? Do you measure it, etc.? Okay, fantastic. So we can see the polls here. So 4% said extremely well, but 20% said very well, 47% said somewhat well, and then 30% said either not very well or we do not manage our corporate culture. But majority of people fall in this somewhat well. And honestly, that falls in line with exactly what our survey found with HR.com. A lot of people fall into this, we're doing some things. I know we could be doing better, but we're not doing terribly. So thank you all for participating. We have one more poll now, our second polling question, which is, now that we know whether you actively manage your corporate culture, how would you rate your company's culture? And obviously, you all are in the HR realm of your organization, so you're probably more in tune with the pulse of the organization than a lot of other people. You're probably more in tune than your leadership is. So if you were to take a stab at rating your company's culture as either very strong or very weak or somewhere in between, how do you think you would fall? Do you have a positive corporate culture? Do you have a corporate culture that's, dare I say, strategic and driving your business initiatives? Or, you're not sure, you wish you knew more? Take a second, even after you finish this poll, to think about, how could I find out if I have a good company culture, because I'm not sure. All right, perfect. Poll results are in. Similar idea here, where most people fall into this average, 23% weak or very weak, and we still have this, some strong and very strong, which is fantastic. We tend to see at CultureIQ in our data that smaller companies feel like their company culture is a bit stronger because they have more control, right? If you're all sitting on the same floor, you're only 10 people. So interesting. Think about the size of your company and how you think that might have an interplay into your answer here. All right, thank you all so much for participating in our polls. We have one more later on in the deck, but let's dive into what some of the survey results were from our HR.com survey. And apologies, we took screenshots from the white paper, so if the background looks a little funky, that's why. But we wanted to give you a preview into what you're actually going to see when you get our HR.com CultureIQ white paper. Okay, so this was the second question that we asked. How would you rate your company's culture? And here's overall the responses we received. So 39% said strong or very strong. 64% said not strong or very strong. And the way we defined culture in this question was the way things get done within an organization. There are various ways to define corporate culture. The way CultureIQ defines it, is the how and the why things get done within an organization. So not just what's happening, but the underlying reasoning as to why those things are happening. Because yes, culture is all about behaviors and how people show up at work, but it's also interesting to dive one level deeper into why are people behaving the way they're behaving. And I'm sure if you think to yourself one example behavior within even just your department that you wish you could change, and if you ask why, the 5 whys, I'm sure you could get at, this underlying reason. So at Culture IQ, we focus on the how and the why. But what this slide is really showing us is a lot of us don't feel like we have a super strong corporate culture, which is why you joined this webinar. So we're going to talk about how to take some steps towards that. The next slide shows this same image on the left, but we've paired it with this image on the right, which was, do you think corporate culture drives your company's competitive advantage? And I was actually surprised that some people don't think so, because I so strongly believe that it does. But 73% of you did say, yes, corporate culture drives a competitive advantage. But what's really interesting here is, okay, if we think corporate culture drives your company's competitive advantage, why don't we feel like we have strong corporate cultures, right? That's the goal in business, right? To have that competitive advantage, to beat out the competition, to, hit your numbers. And so why aren't we considering corporate culture as a key lever for improving our business? And that's why we did this white paper, was to figure out some of the stuff that's going on behind the scenes. And to me, this slide really shows the call to action, especially if you're one of those people that thinks, we don't have a super strong corporate culture, but we do think that it's a competitive advantage. How do we close that gap together with our teams and our leadership to start the culture conversation at our companies? Next slide. All right, so jumping into a lot of our content, and to me this is really the good stuff. This section is not in our white paper, but you will find it in these slides when you see it later. And I encourage you to download these slides and repurpose them for your meetings with your leadership teams. So to me, this is a bonus for joining the webinar. But this is a presentation that actually our head of culture strategy, David Shanklin, does at various conferences and whatnot, and the title of it is Engaging the C-Suite in the Culture Conversation. So this is really about how do you tie culture to finances, right? Because that's what leaders care about the most in general, of course, not everyone, but a lot of the times it is. And so you'll see on the next few slides that it just puts more of that money lens and the ROI piece of culture. And of course, as data shows, and we'll get more into this later in the webinar, leadership is the most important part of corporate culture, and it's also the biggest hindrance to corporate culture. So a little foreshadow. But okay, let's dive in. So first thing we asked, and this was in our white paper, but we asked the HR folks who took our survey, how would you rate your organization's profitability compared to other organizations? So this was really taking a pulse on, do you understand where your company is in the marketplace? Do you understand where your competitors are? And this was interesting because 20% said, I'm not sure, which makes sense. A lot of people are living in this day-to-day HR world where they're focusing on, recruiting the right people and making sure everyone gets paid, and there's a lot on your plate. But more and more in the HR world, we're talking about HR getting a seat at the boardroom table and HR being a strategic business partner to the business. And to me, step one of HR being taken seriously in that strategic manner is understanding the business as a whole, because that's how HR can drive strategy, and that's how HR can potentially help champion these culture initiatives to drive strategy. So it's important to understand that link. And maybe it's just, if you are in this 20% of I'm not sure, maybe it's just having a meeting with someone outside of HR to talk about how the business is doing and to get a better understanding of that. Anyway, so then the next 3 slides we're going to get into some things you could maybe think about sharing with your leadership team. So I know there's a lot in this image, and this was actually taken from Great Place to Work, and I'll walk you through this. So this tracks from the first list that came out in 1998 through the last one that came out in 2016, and we're looking at publicly traded companies on the Fortune 100 best companies to work with. So that's that red line, and we're comparing that to the Russell 3000 and the Russell 1000, which are the gray lines. And what we see, which is big at the top, is this 3 times return over this 17-year period. And what's most interesting about this chart is if you look at, and I don't have a pointer, but if you look at that 08, 09 time period, which was obviously the recession, you can see a big dip in all of the lines. But what's interesting is if you hypothetically got onto this list in 98 and then got out during this recession in 08, 09 at the very bottom of the market, you still would have doubled your money. Right? That red line is still higher than the gray line. But if you had invested in the market and not the Fortune 100 best, you would have made nothing. And then additionally, when you look at the recovery, so you look at the years following, you see a much, much steeper recovery, which is reflected in that 3 times return. So I've heard, our head of culture strategy say this all the time, but it really is true. You're bulletproofing your business, because even in the worst of times, which were 08, 09, you still were doing better because you were that Fortune 100 best company to work for, because you had an amazing corporate culture. So this really can be preventative. This can be, forward thinking. It can really have an impact long term on your organization. So this next slide, this was a study by Professor John Cotter and James Haskett, and if you haven't had the opportunity to read anything by either of those authors, I highly recommend you do a Google search. They both have done a lot in not only the corporate culture space, but just in management and business space, and particularly in thinking about the people side of business, which you're all in HR. It's what you're passionate about, I hope. And so in this study, there were 200 companies. It was over an 11-year period, so really longitudinal study here. And they found a few things. They found that strong corporate cultures facilitate the ability to adapt to the changing world, because, of course, over 11 years, a lot of things happen, and they were able to see how these companies adapted to change while still having strong financial results. They also found that cultures that really valued their employees, customers, and owners were those that encouraged leadership from everyone within the firm. So it wasn't just, the owner's responsibility or the leader's responsibility. It was these firms with performing-enhancing cultures inspired leadership throughout. And so it's just interesting to see the growth of revenue, employment, stock price, and net income be so massive compared to those firms that they studied that didn't have those performance-enhancing cultures. Next slide, please. And so finally, the last study I want to share with you, this is from Gallup, and this is their State of the American Workforce from 2013, so a few years ago. If you haven't had a chance to look at this, it's public. You just have to sign up through Gallup, and I highly recommend you take a look at it because it's very interesting. But what this is basically showing is employee engagement has financial outcomes. As you can see in the speech bubble, low engagement is costing the U.S. billions billions of dollars. Companies with high employee engagement showed that 22% higher profitability, 21% productivity, 10% higher customer service metrics, which, this translates, especially for HR, this translates to retention. This translates to better talent acquisition. And what's so powerful about this study that Gallup did is they pulled 25 million employees, right? Massive study in the United States. And so if you're ever looking for a business case for culture, or even if you're looking for a business case for recruiting and training and just the importance of productivity, I highly recommend you pull some of these stats for your leadership, because it really is huge. All right, let's move on. Measuring culture. So this is a topic that is obviously near and dear to my heart because I work at CultureIQ, and this is one of our key missions, is to really start to put numbers to something that has previously felt so intangible, and that many of the people that come and talk to us still are like, I don't understand how you could put numbers to this. Well, that's what we're doing, and we think it's really important. Next slide, please. And just to kick us off, a little quote from Peter Drucker. We talk about Peter Drucker a lot at CultureIQ. You may have heard the quote, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." It's the background of my LinkedIn page if you link in me later. But Peter Drucker, just, why do we care about him? Well, he was a management consultant, he was a professor, he's an author of many, many books. And he came up with this idea of management by objectives. And it seems kind of silly now because we all talk about objectives being really important. We talk about, our 2017 business goals, and, it seems obvious. But he really put an emphasis on this idea of managing towards goals. And he did an interesting study and actually wrote a book for any of you that are interested in learning more, where he spent 2 years working inside General Motors, and he was able to observe from the C-suite down to the factory line workers what was happening, and he looked at what was happening through this people lens, and he wrote a book called The Concept of the Corporation in 1946, and it's crazy how much what he found during that study is still so relevant today. So if you have the opportunity, highly recommend you Google Peter Drucker. But you cannot improve what you cannot measure. And some of you may disagree with that. But from my perspective and from CultureIQ's perspective is, how are you supposed to know if what you're doing is actually improving if you don't try and measure it somehow? Or how do you know if what you're doing is effective and that you should be continuing to put your money and resources to it if you don't have any sort of ability to know if it's working? Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so we asked, how does your organization actively manage its corporate culture? And the number one thing that came out, no surprise, is this employee engagement survey concept, which many organizations are doing. For those of you that have been in the HR realm for a while, it sort of started a decade ago, if not longer, with this idea of employee satisfaction. Gallup was really championing that at the time. Then it moved into this employee engagement idea, employees that are engaged are more productive. And now what we're seeing and what CultureIQ is championing is this idea of a corporate culture survey instead of just an employee engagement survey. But to this point, I think it's interesting what one of the respondents said, and we pulled it here. Managing culture is a continuous process, not a one-time event. And one of the things that we find with these employee engagement surveys is we do them once a year. We get super valuable input and insight into what's going on in the organization. And then maybe we do some action planning, and then we don't measure it until a year later. And part of the problem is you only have insight on this annual basis. You're missing all of those peaks and valleys. You're missing the nuances of what's going on in your organization. So we find that it's very effective to measure culture instead of engagement, which, by the way, I'll dive into that a little bit, the difference, but also to do it on a continuous basis, to think about what sort of pulse survey can I do, to think about what focus groups can I do or interviews can I do. This doesn't just have to be surveying, right? This could be taking a pulse however makes sense for your organization. I will say the employee engagement survey allows the ability to have an anonymous survey, so employees are more likely to be thoughtful and honest in their response versus, having a one-on-one or a focus group with an HR person. They might feel like their response is going to get back to them somehow. So the anonymous survey is really important. Quickly, just side note, at CultureIQ, we make our surveys anonymous because we don't allow anyone in the organization to view responses for a group that has less than 5 people. So even if you're filtering by location and department and all of these things in your survey responses, you'll literally get a notice saying this group has less than 5 people and you can't view their results. So we take our anonymity policy very seriously. But of course, last note on this slide, measuring employee engagement, which 55% of you say that you're doing an employee engagement survey, is step 1. Step 2 is how you communicate with your employees that took the employee engagement survey, how you let them know that you've heard them, and what action you take. And then hopefully you remeasure maybe sooner than a year later to see if whatever action you took is actually working. On the next slide, I would like to briefly discuss the difference between engagement and culture, since this is really becoming a hot topic in the HR space right now. So on our HRcom survey, we asked about employee engagement surveys. We didn't even ask about culture surveys because it's a fairly new concept, and we find that people still don't quite understand what a culture survey is and what the difference is. But an engagement survey asks employees how they feel about their culture, while a culture survey, which is what we try and do at CultureIQ, gets at what is actually causing those feelings. So it's one thing to know, okay, or your employees are satisfied at their job, right? Great. But let's say you find out that they're not really satisfied at their job. Well, you don't really have any other information based on that question to help improve and to make your employees more satisfied. But with a culture survey, we design it in a way that it lends really well to taking action to addressing those root causes, so that if you were to ask, are you satisfied, or on our survey we ask an employee net promoter score, which is how likely are you to recommend CultureIQ as a place to work. That's sort of our engagement score that we use when we do our analysis. But with our data, you can understand why that engagement score is either good or bad, versus just that is good or bad. So just really quick, I wanted you all to level set to understand why we talk about engagement versus culture. And on this slide, just as a teaser, this is our 10 core qualities as part of our larger culture survey that we do at CultureIQ. These are the 10 core qualities to high-performing organizations that we found in our research. And so we try and measure these against an employee net promoter score to see what's driving that engagement the most. So if one area is super low, we can understand, okay, this is an area in your culture that we should focus on. All right, last big section for this webinar is managing culture. And we actually have another poll, which is, what is the biggest obstacle to strengthening your company's culture? And obviously, there might be things on this list that come to mind as the biggest obstacle, but I'm sure there's multiple things, so pick the one that's most top of mind. We only could fit 5 in our polling tool. So these are actually the 5 that we asked on our HR.com survey as well. So we'll be able to compare your responses for those of you who are on the webinar with those responses from the survey. So is it leadership? Is it employees participating? Is it funding or money? Is it bandwidth? People just don't have time to think about company culture. Or was it even some merger or acquisition? Okay, so poll results. Leadership buy-in came in front and center at 40%. Employee participation close second with 38%. And then funding, bandwidth, and merger and acquisition closer to the bottom. Very interesting. So leadership buy-in at 40%, employee participation at 38%. If we flip to the next slide, so one thing that was a bit different is in our HR.com webinar, white paper, we allowed people to pick more than one, which is why these numbers look so different. However, it's interesting that in our HR.com survey, sorry, can you go back one? In our HR.com survey, apologies, I'm looking at the wrong slide. So we didn't show the answers to the biggest obstacle yet. I wanted to set the tone with this previous slide. Okay, so with this previous slide, so in our HR.com white paper, we asked this question, and it came out that leadership was significantly more. So in this poll, it wasn't as big of a gap, but in our white paper, it was a much bigger gap, and it was interesting to see that leadership was the biggest obstacle, but also leadership was seen as those who set the direction for culture at your company. So we do hear a lot that culture is owned by everyone, which I think you all on this webinar agree, which is why you put it at 38%. But it's also interesting to think about where are employees getting their ideas from, right? Where is the tone being set for company culture? And this slide really shows an astonishing 83% say, you know, culture might be owned by everyone, but it's really that C-suite executive leadership at the company that's setting the direction. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So on the left, we asked which of the following describes the reasons why you do not actively manage culture. On the right, we asked that biggest obstacle question. I'm just going to start at the right since you just answered this poll question. But at the top, leadership buy-in, 52%. Then came employee participation, funding, bandwidth, and then mergers. So interesting to compare your responses here versus what was in the white paper. Still, leadership came out on top, as it always does. And then which of the following describes the reasons why you don't actively manage culture? So we asked in the white paper first, do you actively manage culture? And for those that said no, we asked them why. And lack of leadership support came up at the top as well. I also thought it was interesting, the not sure how to start. Maybe some of you feel that way, and I'm hoping that this webinar gives you kind of a first step in how to start. But really, the point of this slide is to show that leadership clearly came out as a top reason why perhaps you as an HR person who knows this is important aren't getting the support that you need in order to address company culture. So this is taken directly from our survey. These were 3 responses that we thought were really interesting. So the first one, I'll just read these and you can follow along. We want to be led by examples and get everyone involved starting at the top. If leaders aren't engaged in your cultures, employees won't be engaged. And I think that this is felt across, I know at least our clients at CultureIQ, this is a common theme. They want leaders to be visible. They want them to be engaged and driving the business so that they can also feel motivated to be engaged and drive the business. The second middle one says culture should be defined and promoted by upper management. All employees should be aware of the expectations and held accountable for promoting culture. And this is really interesting because it has both the defined and promoted by upper management, which we saw in the previous data, but this is also putting some of the accountability on the employees, right? It is everyone's job to own culture, but employees need to know how. They need to know what those expectations are. They need to be held accountable for it. They, whether it's, being rewarded or recognized for following values, or whether it's your performance management is tied into those values. This is how employees understand what their expectations are through these, honestly, very HR type initiatives at your organization. And then finally, leadership must practice what they preach, and the employees must see it in their leaders. When that happens, anything is possible. I kind of like the positivity of this last comment because it's so true. When leaders are role modeling the appropriate behaviors, it really helps the frontline employees be more accountable and want to model those behaviors as well. And like I was saying at the very beginning of this webinar, it's difficult when you get bigger, your company is spread out across various locations. Maybe there's just no possible way for your employees to see the CEO, and that's totally understandable. But how can we make it so that the C-suite or whatever leaders that are important to your people are more visible? Maybe it's video conferencing. Maybe it's a newsletter. Maybe it's trickled down talking points or messaging that the senior managers can use. It's just this idea of leadership really came out in this webinar and in this white paper, and honestly it comes out a lot with our clients, so that was very in line. Next slide. So Edgar Schein quote, "The only thing of real importance that leaders do is to create and manage culture." I love this quote. This is saying, obviously leaders are responsible for running their business, growing their business, etc. But also, as you continue to grow, you hire people who are also really good at this. And then you as a leader become this symbol for what the company stands for. And so I think this is a really powerful quote. Similar to the little background I gave on Peter Drucker, just who the heck is this Edgar Schein and why do we care about this quote? He is a professor. He was a professor at MIT in their business school. And his model of organizational culture is from the 1980s. And basically he breaks down organizational culture into three distinct components. So the first is artifacts and behaviors. That's what we tend to think about when we think about culture, is those behaviors. The second one is espoused values. So when you think about your organization and the values that your organization is sharing both internally and externally. And then finally is assumptions. And so like I was mentioning how CultureIQ defines culture as the how and why things get done, Edgar Schein really gets at that why, that reasoning behind behaviors is so crucial to the corporate culture equation. And of course, if you have a second after this webinar, you could do a quick Google of Edgar Schein. He's got some good stuff. Okay, so diving a little bit into our white paper, we asked a load of questions. I'm obviously, it's already 1:45 Eastern. I am not going to be going through all of these at all, but just to orient you for when you do get your hands on the white paper, the topics that we asked about are on the left. These are all very important topics to corporate culture: hiring, measuring and action planning, relationship building, growth and development, and communications. And then we asked our participants about specific initiatives, and we got this list of initiatives just based on what our CultureIQ clients are doing and what's very popular in the corporate culture space. So we came up with this list because we were really curious, and that's the topic of this whole webinar. How's your corporate culture compared to other companies, and what are you doing that maybe you should be measuring, and what are you doing that maybe, or what are you not doing that maybe you should start doing? So we really wanted to dive more into that, and what I'm going to show you on the next few slides are what's bolded here. So not everything, obviously, but a few key things. All right, so the first part is hiring, and for any of you that are involved at hiring at your organization, onboarding is a huge, huge component of corporate culture. It is the number one, first feeling that your new hires have when they start at your organization. And so it was interesting because when we asked about the importance of culture-specific onboarding, 47% said it's important or very important. Only 13% said not important. But then that number continues to drop when we asked about it being effectively managed and measured. So effectively managed, only 36% said either acceptable or very good. Only 3% said very good. And then measuring it, only, 28% said that they measure it. And so to me, what this is saying is, okay, we know this is important, and probably a lot of you, especially in bigger organizations, are doing this. But how effective are we at continuously improving our culture-specific onboarding? How often are we updating it? Are we asking people who went through the onboarding process their thoughts of how it went? In fact, are we even tracking our new hires, through a 30, 60, 90 onboarding survey? How are we really understanding if what we're doing is really working the way that we want it to work? The fear I personally have when we talk to our clients is you could be doing a lot of things that check the boxes, but are you doing them in a way that's really impacting your culture? And the only way to really know that is to measure it. But anyway, culture-specific onboarding, that's what I pulled out in this hiring topic. The next topic was measurement and action planning, and we pulled out the employee survey since that was most common in the survey. 55% said they do an employee engagement survey, and also this is one of the key things that CultureIQ does, so I thought this was interesting. 35% that an employee survey is important or very important, and then of course we see that fall a little with effectively manage it. 20% say they effectively manage it. 21% said that they measure it, which that's a little meta, like measuring an employee survey, but we have had clients that have asked, annually, what did you think of this survey? What are we missing from this survey? What do you think we should really be tracking that we're not? And that's a really powerful way to involve your employees, especially if they're very used to taking these surveys over and over again and having a bit of survey fatigue. But I also thought it was interesting that 27% didn't think surveying their employees was important. I'm wondering if it's because they get feedback in other ways, like interviews, focus groups, anecdotes, etc. But I really would like to encourage you, even if you're a small organization, to think about how could the anonymity of a survey help my leadership or my HR team understand what our goals should be to improve our corporate culture. Okay, next, and we have 3 more. So next was relationship building was the topic. We asked various things, but I pulled out mentoring. I think mentoring is super powerful. And over my years, I've been involved in a lot of awesome mentoring programs. I've also been involved in some not so great mentoring programs where I wish they had asked me in a survey what I thought of mentoring. But this is also something, if you're not doing any sort of mentorship program at your organization currently, really easy, free way to promote cross-functional team collaboration, to promote cross-level relationships, and really it could be the cost of a cup of coffee, or it could just be the cost of a 30-minute phone call. So something to think about if you're not doing this. 48% said important or very important, so a lot of you do agree that this is important, but only 25% that they have said that they are acceptable or very good at managing it, and only 21% said they measure it. So we see this a lot, that companies are doing something that is so great, but they're not tracking it, so they don't know, maybe people hate the coffee and they wish it were lunch. Something as simple as that, or maybe they feel like the 30-minute phone call isn't enough time and they wish, the program allowed for an hour. You don't know until you ask your employees. Moving on, growth and development, leadership training for managers. This is super crucial at your organization. 52% said it's important or very important, but only 15, I was so shocked, 15% said that they effectively manage and measure it. So even if you're doing some sort of leadership or management training for people who are new managers or people who are promoted, or how do you know it's going well if you don't measure it? All right, moving on to the next one, and this is the last one, is town halls. And I actually pulled this because, on a personal note, we just did our first town hall at CultureIQ because we hear about this being done at much larger organizations, but we wanted to see what it would be like. And the idea was, a meeting with everyone involved, and the idea is everyone can ask questions. It's a collaborative discussion. It doesn't matter what level or department you're in. It's just a forum to share. And 33% of respondents thought that town halls were important. 24% said they effectively manage it. 18% measure it. And really, I think it's interesting because whenever you have some sort of big event or big meeting, think about sending a survey after. Was this helpful? Were you paying attention? Did you wish that leadership talked about something different? This could be for even a corporate retreat, anything. People want to be able to give their feedback, and you want the meeting to be productive. So it can be really helpful to understand how it went. All right, so I believe we're wrapping up. I see that we have about 7 minutes left. But in summary, some of the stats that you'll see in the white paper, 73% of the HR folks that took the survey believe that culture offers a competitive advantage, but only 39% believe their culture is strong or very strong. That's where the disconnect is. It would be interesting to ask your leadership, what they think. They might surprise you. They might really think corporate culture is important and might be willing to put some money into it, especially if you show them those financial slides. 55% use employee engagement surveys to measure culture. If this is not currently something that you're doing, it might be worth thinking about surveying, even if it's just a free survey through SurveyMonkey, or if you want something more robust, obviously you can talk to CultureIQ. And 83% believe that C-suite executive leadership sets the direction for culture. And I know we talked a bit about leadership, but leadership is the primary hindrance, but also the primary reason why it can work. And that can be stressful if you don't have leadership buy-in. So think about how can you take what you learned from this webinar and have a conversation with your leaders around corporate culture, since we do know that they really are setting the tone from the top. Finally, some suggested next steps. First, if you don't know where to start, and 20% of the people on our survey didn't, understand the current state of your culture, measure it. As the quote by Peter Drucker said, you cannot improve what you cannot measure. So even if it's not totally measuring your holistic culture, but it's measuring, one initiative or one meeting, take a step to start to get that two-way feedback going. Second, talked about the importance of leadership. Build the business case for your leaders. most likely your C-suite cares about numbers, right? They want to see the ROI. They want to know where their investment's going. So share with them the studies. If you do some sort of measurement and get numbers and data behind your culture, share that with them. It's really powerful when leaders can see, well, 65% of your employees don't feel like you communicate enough, right? When leaders see that, they go, oh, wow, maybe I should think about this. So build the business case and share those numbers. Third, actively involve leadership. So it's one thing, let's say, you get their buy-in, they're all for it, they give you a budget, but that's it. Then they say, let me know how it goes in 6 months. Well, as the survey showed, that's not really the case. They need to be involved. They need to be visible. They need to be, driving the mission, speaking about the values, and culture should ideally be one of the main things that leadership is driving in their meetings. That's how they're going to keep the rest of the organization engaged with this idea of corporate culture. And then finally, or two other quick things, focus on 1 to 2 things at a time. Whether you're doing a million things right now or doing nothing right now, try and see if you can focus on 1 or 2 things, because we found that sometimes it's overwhelming to do a little bit everywhere, and it's much more effective to pick that one thing to focus on. And then finally, be patient. Corporate culture is not easy to change. Because what you're really trying to change are people's habits. Back to the first example I gave where we were trying to make employees more compliant with these rules for the government, that was really hard for employees to connect to on a personal level. So how do you make this, how do you make culture part of the day-to-day lives of your employees? And for any of you that's tried to start a new habit, 2017, maybe you decided you're going to go to the gym or, do any of those New Year's resolutions, it's hard to stick to a habit. It takes time, it takes energy, and corporate culture is something that needs to change slowly over time, but is something that can change if you are paying the right amount of attention to it. So just a question for thought in our last 2 minutes. Think about one step that you can take today, tomorrow, by the end of this week to strengthen your company's culture or even just your team's culture, because I guarantee you there's one free, not super time-consuming thing that you could do to make your place a better place to work. So I know we only have 1 minute, so I don't think we're going to have time for questions, but we do have all of your questions here, and of course you can reach out through CultureIQ.com or Rea@CultureIQ.com. That's my email, REA@CultureIQ.com, with any questions. If you're interested in learning more about CultureIQ, take a look at our website. I'm actually on the front page of the website. If you want to see what I look like, check me out on LinkedIn. And let us know if you want to chat more. Thank you so much for attending this webinar, and I will hand it back to HR.com. Thank you all.
Well, thank you so much to Rea Abrahams of CultureIQ for presenting this very informative webcast today. These are just a few reminders for the attendees. As a participant of this webcast, you will be receiving a copy of the report via email. If you would like to view this webcast again, the archive recording and slides will be available for up to 7 days. All webcast credits are stored in your HR.com account. Watch for your HR.com email to arrive within 1 to 2 business days. It will contain the certification credit information. And your feedback is important to us, so please take a moment and fill out the exit survey that will appear on your screen. This concludes today's webcast. Enjoy the rest of your day.